Lord Saville, I don't know if you were able to listen to Sir John Bell just before the news, who was talking, as I just mentioned, about this inquiry, which he is not a fan of. He doesn't think that it's going to achieve much, and that he does think it will be a waste of time at such an important time when people's attention should be on the job in hand. Would you agree with that?
I don't know that I've got a view on that. It's something that the government has promised. It's something that people have been asking for more or less since the pandemic started. So one can see why the government has decided to have an inquiry. It would serve a purpose, I think, if it gave us lessons for the next one.
Yes, I can see that point. But just going back to the point you made before that, it's something that people have been demanding, and therefore it's something that the government felt they had to give to those demanding. But of course, the people demanding it, yes, they have been victims' families, but much more vocally has been the opposition. So in other words, do you think this is a political football that's been kicked from the opposition to the government, and the government is now kicking it into the long grass?
Well, I don't know that the government's kicking it into the long grass. It's definitely political in one sense, as you just said. The opposition keen to attack the government whenever it reasonably can. But I think on the whole, although I'm not a political-minded person, I think on the whole it would be a good idea, provided its main concentration was on what lessons we can learn in preparation for what the scientists say will undoubtedly be further pandemics in the future.
So with your experience of having been there setting up an inquiry, obviously you have to choose a chairman or a chairwoman, and then you have to set out the remit of the inquiry. Presumably that is almost the most important bit to make sure that the inquiry is not so wide, that the remit's not so wide, that it takes years and years and years. And in fact, the main players whose actions you're investigating have long left the scene of the crime.
You're absolutely right. The terms of reference are very important indeed. You can have them too wide, in which case the inquiry will go on forever. Or you can have them too narrow, in which case people will say, well, this is all a whitewashing affair, and they're trying to shut out the really important evidence. So it's going to be a very difficult question to decide exactly what the terms of reference should be.
And how does that decision get made of the terms of the reference and the choosing of the chairman or chairwoman? Because we've seen with other inquiries that in itself has been very contentious. One of the inquiries that's ongoing is on to its fourth chairperson.
Well, indeed. In my case, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, I was presented with terms of reference by the government, and they said these are the terms of reference which we would like you to use. And I was perfectly happy with them. And that, I think, is normally the case. But I repeat, it's going to be quite difficult in this case to get them right.
And so presumably that's the first thing that we as political onlookers and political nerds should be really focusing on, the remit and how that's decided, and whether, because there's no point in having an inquiry, as you said, that can then be dismissed as a whitewash.
Absolutely. And this is why, I'm sorry to say it for the third time, this is why fixing those terms of reference is so important.
And when we look at that, obviously, I know that you're not, a scientist or a medical person, but the terms of reference, some people are saying it should be absolutely everything. It should be government decisions about lockdowns. It should be about care homes. It should be about do not resuscitate. It should be about the BAME community and whether, their risk factor was taken into consideration. And others saying actually it should be much more about simply whether we were ready and had heeded warnings about possible pandemics and things had been put into place to make sure that we were as ready as we could have been.
Well, I repeat, in my view, the inquiry is likely to serve some purpose if it concentrates on what lessons we can learn from how the present pandemic was treated in this country and indeed abroad.
And looking if
we don't look at the lessons we can learn, then I'm tending to the view that the inquiry really isn't going to achieve very much, except possibly for some political purposes.
It's very interesting that you're saying there, if it isn't about lessons being learnt, it's potentially not worth the bother. When it comes to putting into a remit, this inquiry must be about lessons that learned. How do you literally do that in legal speak?
Well, you have to look at a lot of material. Well, you have to see how things developed. I think particularly with this pandemic, not just in this country, but in other countries of the world, of how people reacted, what went right, what went wrong, and how better it could be done in the future. I mean, if you don't do that, then I repeat, I'm not convinced it's going to be really worthwhile. Whatever they do, whatever the terms of reference, it's going to take a long time. There's going to be the need, as there is with these big inquiries, for a very long period of preparation.
And how long are you talking, Lord Saville?
But it's impossible to say. I remember when doing the Bloody Sunday inquiry, I was constantly being pestered by governments and otherwise as to when we would finish. And it's very difficult to give an answer to that because the new material comes up every day. You've got to make sure you are doing two things. One, doing as thorough a job as you can, but equally doing a job which is fair to the people concerned. If people are going to be criticised, and I suspect they undoubtedly will, then they have to be given a fair opportunity to answer the criticisms. And so if you're engaged in a thorough inquiry, you've got to look at everything which appears to be relevant. And if it's fair, you've got to give people a reasonable time and opportunity to give their side of the story.
What would your advice be to the potential chairmen and chairwomen who presumably are being phoned up at the moment and said, do you fancy doing this? I mean, it sounds from your experience that it's a job not for the faint-hearted.
I think I'd agree with that. It was a very interesting thing. It took me 12 years of my professional life. And to this day, people still complain that it took too long and so on, which I'm afraid I don't agree with, because we did have to look at a great deal of material. And unlike this new COVID inquiry, we had to look at material that was decades old. And that took a great deal of time and research.
Presumably, the nearer, the less time there has been to elapse, the easier it is in some ways to get hold of the evidence and the data that you need to pore over the whys and wherefores of how decisions were made.
I would have thought so, yes. Yeah. It was quite amazing that the amount of material we were able to discover after doing quite a lot of work. For example, we got some timings when these shootings in Bloody Sunday took place, pretty accurate timings, because we managed to track down the logs that the ambulance drivers had kept on that day of their movements. But that sort of thing takes some time to discover and to put into the order of things.
And talking of time, I know you said before this inquiry was announced some weeks ago that if the government did decide to launch an inquiry, you believed it would take 7 or 8 years. Is that still your view?
I can't I did say that, indeed. It's very, very difficult to give a precise estimate because you don't know what you've got to do until you've collected all the materials. You've heard all the witnesses, you're sure that you've done a thorough job, you're sure that you've done a fair job. But certainly it would seem to me that an inquiry, even if it was confined to what lessons can we learn from the pandemic, is going to take a long time and shouldn't, I think, be confined to this country because it was a world event, and it will be very interesting and possibly very helpful to see how other countries dealt with the same problem.
Just one last question before I bring Tom, the one criticism that's been made of inquiries like this has been that, yes, they can bring about some institutional reforms of whatever institution they're investigating, but they very, very rarely bring in any meaningful political changes or reforms. Would you agree with that?
It depends entirely on the nature of the inquiry. Some inquiries, like mine, were not to learn lessons, but to try and find out what happened a very long time ago. Other inquiries are set up to learn lessons. So I don't think you can make a general comment about inquiries.
Lord Saville, it's Tom here. Thank you for joining us this morning.
You're more than welcome.
May I ask you about your response to the Ballymurphy inquest this week? Of course, Bloody Sunday was all about the activities of the parachute regiment in 1972. Ballymurphy, similar incident, shooting of civilians by a parachute regiment soldiers around the similar time. Did those pretty damning and shocking declarations by the inquest that there were at least 9 civilians killed unlawfully by almost certainly by British Army soldiers, did that surprise you?
No, it didn't. A lot of terrible things took place. And in the course of the Bloody Sunday inquiry, we didn't concentrate just on the afternoon when the shootings in Derry took place. We looked back a long way to see how the situation had developed, or perhaps deteriorated is a better word, in Northern Ireland in those times. And in the course of doing that, of course, we did look at other incidents, including Ballymurphy and I'm afraid rather a lot of others on both sides of the divide. So that all one can say is that it was not a good time in Northern Ireland.
Well, that's certainly true. And in terms of what happens from here, I mean, these events were a very long time ago, of course, nigh on 50 years ago, longer perhaps even for Ballymurphy, nigh on 50 years. There is, in your view, is there any point whatsoever in trying to pursue criminal charges against members of the British Army who may have broken the law over this, or is it just simply far too long ago?
Well, there are strong arguments on both sides. Those who died at the hands of terrorists, or indeed the army, want perfectly reasonably to see justice done. Whereas on the other side, the years go by, it becomes history, events taking place 30, 40 years ago. And you can say quite strongly that it's no longer fair that people should be chased up to the end of their lives, especially if material has been present over previous years, which could have allowed prosecutions brought much earlier.
Where do you fall on that side of the argument? Which one do you believe in?
It's a difficult question. And I think it just depends on the circumstances of each particular case.
Okay. The government has an idea, which it hasn't quite issued in the public domain yet, but we very much know this is the case, which is the only way to end this continual cycle of legacy prosecutions and dragging soldiers to court, 50 years after the event. Many of them might be dead, or if they're not, then they're in their 70s and 80s now. Their idea is to put in position a statute of limitations for all combatants, if you can swallow that word, on the side of the trouble. So paramilitaries, IRA members, IRA killers potentially don't get prosecuted for what they might have done, and British Army soldiers also are exempt from prosecutions for what they might have done. Is that, in your view, the way forward?
It is a way forward. I'm not entirely convinced it is the way forward. I think the best thing that has worked in recent years is the reconciliation hearings that they had in South Africa, which I do think helped. But if you just put a blanket ban, you are going to leave people who lost husbands, wives, children at the hands of apparent murderers left without justice, or as they might put it, closure.